Okay, so my name is Matthew James Gray. I'm a lecturer here, and I just recently submitted my PhD at Adelaide Uni in the history department. I didn't do it on the early church period. I did it on the English Baptist, so a bit of a different time frame. But I've lectured on the early church fathers quite a bit. I've done some study in previous things on them. First thing that I'll say is that I tend not to use the term fathers. I tend to use the word forebears. So I'll usually talk in terms of the apostolic forebears or the church forebears or that kind of stuff. And part of that is just a recognition that there were women too, right? There were women too. Now, it's true that we don't have as much written evidence of them because a lot of them didn't write. But if you look hard enough, it's quite evident that women had a tremendous influence over the early church in a variety of contexts. And so, just as a bit of a tip of the hat to them, I kind of acknowledge that. So I'm mainly going to talk about the apostolic forebears tonight. I might dive into the apologists, the early apologists, who were part of the church forebears as well. Now, when I'm talking about the apostolic forebears, I'm talking not about the apostolic era. Okay, it's one of those little odd things that church historians do, where what we're talking about is pretty much the group just after the apostolic period. In a lot of ways, it'd be better if we didn't call them the apostolic fathers or forebears, but we actually called them the apostolic sons and daughters, because that's effectively what they end up being.
Polycarp onwards, is it?
Yeah, today I'll talk about a few different ones. So I'll talk about Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch. I might have a little dip into the Shepherd of Hermas for you. The Didache would be another example of this, but I'm not going to spend any time on that. Polycarp would be another example of that. Polycarp of Smyrna. Polycarp's good, really interesting actually, but the prime, it's weird. There's this amazing, Polycarp's this interesting guy in that he's around for 80 years, does an amazing ministry, but the greatest thing he ever does is die. His martyrdom is just a remarkable thing. Okay. Now, it's interesting, several of the writings that I'm going to be talking about tonight, there was a little bit of a slim outside chance that they might even just kind of sneak into the canon for a little while. Most of them didn't, and the reason they didn't is because of the standard reasons why the canon of the Bible was decided upon, that they were ineligible. So namely, the canon, in case you don't happen to know this, the canon of the Bible was based on three criteria. And the first criteria was it written by someone who was either a witness to Jesus or someone who knew a witness to Jesus and could use them as a major source? Right, that was one criteria. The second criteria was that was it written kind of early enough, which kind of corresponds with the first one to a degree. And then the last one was it being used widely across all of the churches? So just a quick aside actually, when we're talking about canonicity, we're not talking about a bunch of fat rich bishops deciding and imposing the Bible on everyone. We're actually talking about a long process of actually each of the churches making that decision as to who they would want, which books they were regularly using and finding relevant. And that's actually one of the reasons why some of these don't get in. A lot of these guys can actually say, I had an apostle as a relative. So Polycarp identified John as one of his spiritual mentors. But they don't get in because while their writings were deeply precious to the communities of which they were a part of, over the time of effectively the voting for the they didn't frame it in that way, but that's effectively how it ended up working. The process of effectively figuring out, yes, we all use this one. People thought that, like, Clement's letter to the Corinthians was cute and it was kind of helpful, but it wasn't one that they were picking up all the time and reading. Whereas Paul's letters to the Corinthians, yeah, they were reading those every week and they were, regularly integrating them into their devotional and worship life. Okay. So, Cyril Richardson, who wrote a definitive book on the early church fathers, famously said, "What marks these writings, though, the Apostolic Forebears, taken as a whole, is their literary simplicity, their earnest religious conviction, and their independence of Hellenistic philosophy and rhetoric." Which is really interesting. They are closer to the New Testament in their artlessness. Isn't it? It almost sounds like a backhanded compliment, doesn't it? But it's actually quite nice. And while they may lack something of its spiritual depth, they reveal an intense concern for its basic message. They come from a time when the church was warring on two fronts, against pagan attack and internal schism. Hence, their peculiar concern is for order. That's quite, and particularly when we look at Clement, you'll see that. The unity of the church around its leaders and the preservation of the faith from perversion are their dominant themes. Ignatius is a very strong theme too. In consequence, the religious spontaneity of the New Testament writings give place to a more moral and ecclesiastical note. Right? So basically, what I think Richardson's getting at there, which I think is helpful, during the early church period, like the New Testament period, when you got the apostles running around and stuff like that, if someone pipes up with something that you're not quite sure about, what's the question you ask to figure out whether they're legit or not? You go, well, what do the apostles say? They hung around with Jesus. They know what Jesus was on about, so therefore they got to be legit. Okay? Do you see what I mean? So, like, the apostles acted as a very clear guide for, is this Christian or not? But once all those lovely apostles die, you've got a bit of a pesky problem. Now who do you go to? Now, there was this nice thing called apostolic succession, and we'll talk about that potentially at a few points today, where basically the apostles said, hey, listen, this guy, he's been my right-hand man, he's legit, he can keep on the torch. I've taught him everything that I know, and I was taught from Jesus, so it goes Jesus to me to him. Awesome. That kind of works, and that is kind of a facet of the Apostolic Fathers. Right? As well as that, there is this certain sense of one of the criticisms people will make of later periods in particularly the Greco-Roman period of the church, which is kind of like, say, 300 onwards, is that it was often wrestling with the implications of Christianity for Greco-Roman philosophy. Okay? So things like Platonism and stuff like that. These guys don't care about that much. Okay? There are elements where they do talk about that kind of stuff, but a lot of them are coming from a less, with the exception of Justin Martyr perhaps, they're not really concerned with those kind of questions yet. Okay? People like Origen or Athanasius or that bunch later on will care about that. And so a lot of these give us a certain glimpse into, first of all, the outworkings of the New Testament era. How you start to discern Christianity beyond what do the apostles say, when you don't have the Bible just pulling it out off your iPhone. Okay? You can't do that yet. Right? You can't, that's a bit facetious, but you can't pull out a codex and say, this is the authoritative word of God yet, because no one's actually decided whether that's actually what's going on there. So with that in mind, they have to find new ways to determine that. And that leads to the question of who's in charge? Like, how do we know anything is anything? And that, therefore, comes to the question of order. That's why that's such a strong theme within the church fathers, the early church forebears, is that they're trying to say, how do we make sense of this now that all bets are off? Those apostles are gone. So let's talk about Clement for a minute, and this might give you a bit of an idea in here. Clement is most well known for his letter to the Corinthians, probably written about the mid-90s AD, which makes it fascinating actually, because who else wrote something really kind of cool around about the early 90s? John. Right? So there's some conjecture and debate about when, like Revelation's an obvious one, but there's potential that that the Gospel of John writes it pretty late in the 90s. What's fascinating is that how I was talking about that canonicity thing? Part of the dimension of that was just that when you picked up one of the books or whatever that got into the canon, they just had something going on in there that other ones, while being good, just didn't have. And it's a bit like, okay, any 80s like sci-fi fans here? Any of you guys ever watched Star Wars and like Star Trek for, like 1? Okay, you will know exactly where I'm going here. There's something special about Star Wars that just transcends time. Like, I mean, most of us would probably get that. Like, Star Wars looks great. It just doesn't look dated. Like Star Wars from 1977. Star Trek, the #1 movie, came around about the same time, and oh my goodness, does it look dated, right? Well, there's a similar kind of dynamic with the Gospels, particularly, say, John, in comparison to Clement. When you read Clement, you go, this is a good read, but it just doesn't have that kind of timeless kapow, be very academic here, timeless kapow that something like John has. So, there is some conjecture about which Clement it actually is. It could be a co-worker of Paul's in Rome, mentioned in Philippians 4:3. Which would be really, really impressive if it was, but it's probably not likely. There is also the possibility that he is Titus Flavius Clemens, the cousin and consul of Emperor Domitian, who was executed with his wife Domitilla in AD 95. Both of these, that's Domitian's wife. Domitian was an odd cat. Both of these seem rather conjectural. Certainly in the official list of Roman bishops, it goes Peter, Linus, Anacletus, and then Clement, who was probably meant to have had the position, who was apparently meant to have the position from AD 90 to 100. Right? So we're still really just on the kind of twilight, if you like, the dusk of that era. Clement reveals a knowledge of the Old Testament scriptures, quotes tons of them, but also a knowledge and a scriptural respect for many writings that later became part of our New Testament. These include 1 Corinthians, which is not particularly surprising since he's writing to the Corinthians, but also James, 1 Peter, Hebrews, and potentially Q, or the Synoptic Gospels.
Does he actually quote them?
He shows strong allusions to them, and again, that idea of scriptural respect, a bit of tipping the hat at regular points. It's an interesting question. Within New Testament critical scholarship of the actual Koine Bible, they will occasionally use Clement as a bit of a, hey, this is also in Clement too, as well as in other manuscripts that we have. Fun little side question. Anyway, Clement's letter was quite famous from early on, being referred to by several prominent 2nd century figures, including Polycarp, and made it into some lists of the New Testament. The letter was written, and if any of you guys who are new, familiar with the New Testament, you will giggle. The letter was written to the Corinthian church because they were breaking into factions. How unlike the Corinthian church. Oh, and they were also really disrespecting their leaders. How things change. Right? For those that aren't familiar, that's pretty much the whole point of Paul's letter, 1st and 2nd letter to the Corinthians. So basically, this is written about, 30 years afterwards, and they're still doing the same stupid stuff they were doing before. He writes, "It is surely more right and reverent for us, my brothers, to obey God than to follow people whose insolent unruliness has made them the ringleaders of this odious rivalry. It is no trifling risk that we run, but on the contrary, the most deadly peril if we rashly lend ourselves to the designs of some who are plunging into strife and sedition to divert us from what is right. Rather, let us show kindliness to one another in the same sweet spirit of tenderness of our Maker. So you can see there some of the undertones of what he's saying. First of all, a strong sense of a threat caused by unruliness, disrespect, division and things like that. It's a very strong pull for unity, and that is partially tied up with order.
You should send this to Malcolm Turnbull.
Oh, dude. Right. Clement tries in this letter everything he can to get them to be unified. He cites the Old Testament to say that they should be unified. He cites natural examples, right? He cites even the legend of the phoenix as an example of them needing to be unified. He uses logic and common sense. He even rains down a little bit of God's judgment for them to just get on track. He even throws in the body of Christ metaphor, which is kind of like a direct thing of, we've gone through this before with you, Corinthians. Like, remember when Paul wrote that to you? Well, I'm just having to reiterate that again. And even tells them to read their own letters from Paul again, which is really handy because it shows, from a historical evidence point of view, it shows us about, that Paul wrote them and that they were, part of the Corinthian context. Central to the solution for Clement is humility. He says, God, it says, opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Now, that's a direct biblical quote, right? So let us attach ourselves firmly to men who have received this grace, the grace of not being up themselves, being humble. Let us clothe ourselves in mutual tolerance of each other's views, cultivating humility and self-restraint, avoiding all gossiping and backbiting, and earning our justification by deeds and not by words. Right? Now, just all of the Reformed people in the room freaking out about the earning thing. I mean, he's merely just talking about stop with the cheap talk, actually live out your faith. Right? I notice out of that also a really strong emphasis again. Do you remember Paul's idea in Corinthians of knowledge puffs up, love builds up? Well, there's very strong elements of that in Clement's writings too. What makes this letter so interesting is it's very formal. Like its tone is really formal. Roman Christianity, it reveals how formal Roman Christian spirituality seems to have become even by this point. Right? So while the New Testament era is commonly identified with a bit of, they all grouped up in house churches and it was a bit of a Wild West and, people were, doing stuff and there was a strong emphasis on the prophetic dynamic of the Spirit and stuff like that. Certainly within the Roman church, and by extension the Corinthian church that Clement's writing to, it had already started to build a certain formality, certainly in the way that they were writing to each other. Right? When we compare it to other texts of the time, it's very different. Bedenson writes, here we find no ecstasies, no miraculous gifts of the Spirit, no demonology, or for want of a better term, spiritual warfare, no preoccupation with the imminent second coming. The church has, Bedenson says, settled down in the world and is going about its task, quote, soberly, discreetly and advisedly, Clement says.
Sounds like a marriage.
Yeah. Christians pray for their secular rulers and for a spirit of submission to authority, even in time of persecution. So just some of the, even by this point, certainly in the capital, there seems to have been a loss to a degree of the original kind of extemporaneous, like crazy joy that you read in Acts. That's tempered down and it's just started to become a little bit more formal. Okay. That can be overdone. For the next couple of centuries, Rome, which was obviously a really big church, they would have upwards of 60 exorcists on their payroll.
60.
Exorcists, right? And that was because it was a clearly identified need within the context of the time. Modernists won't like that, but get over that. Go to Africa and have a nice time and tell the people there about how there aren't any demons. My point here is within the Roman context, clearly they did have a dynamic of that. It's just not a major emphasis within the writing. The emphasis has a lot more kind of settle down than hype up, right? There are also clear indications for several shifts in leadership by this point, and this is an important point. They who present their offerings at such appointed times are accepted and blessed. The high priest, for example, has his own proper services assigned to him. This is from Clement. And the layman is bound by regulations affecting the laity. In the same way, my brothers, when we offer our own Eucharist to God, each one of us should keep up to his own degree. So that's directly from the letter of Clement. And what it indicates is that even at this point, they're starting to use more Old Testament metaphors. Why that's significant is because Old Testament metaphors work well when you are working in some degree compliant to the government. Because like the Old Testament priesthood was compliant with the government. Okay? So there's already a bit less of the, like when Paul writes to the Romans, for example, Paul kind of says, look, pray for your rulers, all that kind of stuff. But he's kind of dealing with a certain degree of subversiveness. Whereas Clement's just trying to be, I don't want to use the word domesticated, but just a little less of that kind of us and them dynamic. This gives us a clear indication that as early as 96 AD, the shift from an eschatological pastoral ecclesiology, an ecclesiology defined by, say, a shepherd or a prophet or something like that, has, to a less eschatological priestly ecclesiology has taken place, at least in some areas of Christianity. That's not the case everywhere, but it is in this case. More than that, Clement sees this as the mechanism which will bring the Corinthians back into line. And furthermore, believes that it is precisely because they have dismissed this model that they have ended up getting into trouble. We then see him give an explicit indication of a very important term, and that is apostolic succession, in a chapter that is worth quoting in full. Right? Now, this is what he writes. Don't worry if you're thinking, a whole chapter? Let's go like the New Testament. I mean, you can do a chapter in 2 seconds. All right, this is what he says. Now, the gospel was given to the apostles for us by the Lord Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ was sent from God. That is to say, Christ received his commission from God, and the apostles theirs from Christ. The order of these two events was in accordance with the will of God. So thereafter, when the apostles had been given their instructions and all their doubts had been set at rest by the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ from the dead, they set out in the full assurance of the Holy Spirit to proclaim the coming of God's kingdom. And as they went through the territories and townships preaching, they appointed their first converts, after testing them by the Spirit, to be bishops and deacons for the believers of the future. This was in no way an innovation, for bishops and deacons had already been spoken of in Scripture long before that. There is a text that says, I will confirm their bishops in righteousness and their deacons in faith. That's Isaiah 60, verse 17 in the Septuagint. Now, my point in that is to show that often when we talk about apostolic succession, what we think they're doing is really a matter of convenience. It's this person was taught by this person, which was taught by this person. So if you want to know what Jesus said, obviously go to that person, right? And that's certainly part of it. But part of his other point is elements that we wouldn't expect there. So for example, do you notice the strong emphasis on the Spirit in that process? Did you notice that? Right, so there's a strong emphasis on that the Spirit worked within the apostles to help them to discern who to pick. And as well, the Spirit worked within those people to form them through the apostles' teaching to be good leaders. Right? As well as that, there is biblical support for this whole process taking place. And going on, not long after, similarly, our apostles knew through our Lord Jesus Christ that there would be dissensions over the title of bishop. In their full foreknowledge of this, therefore, they proceeded to appoint the ministers I spoke of, and they went on to add an instruction that if these should fall asleep, other accredited persons should succeed them in their office. Okay? Right? So the idea is, even if the ones that the apostles appointed die, well, those guys can appoint someone else for when they knock off. Right? It is setting up this very, very clear kind of dimension. Okay? W.C. Friend writes that it is difficult to conceive of the book of Revelation and 1 Clement, both written, it would seem, near the end of the 1st century AD, as products of adherents of the same religion. It's just so different. That Friend is right, except that it's not actually their theology that separates them. Their theology is remarkably similar in a lot of ways. Like they're all lovers of Jesus. It's more that they approach the issues in just vastly different contextual ways. Now, they're all part of the Roman Empire, but they just approach them from a different kind of situation. Okay? Right? As well as that, you just can't deny, as I said before, the fact that there is something going on in things like Revelation, that divine inspiration dynamic to it, that just ain't there in Clement. Like Clement's fine, it's just, apart from the Phoenix reference, which is problematic, but effectively it's doctrinally fine, but it also just doesn't have that same punch, right? There are some fabulously enriching elements to the letter. It has a very high Christology. Jesus is beautifully described by him as the scepter of God's majesty, which is kind of cool. Including explicit belief in the physical resurrection of Jesus, which again is kind of important, right? Clement upholds the Spirit's inspiration of Scripture quite emphatically, and ultimately this leads to a rather Trinitarian statement towards the end. As surely as God lives, as Jesus Christ lives, and as the Holy Ghost also, on whom is set the faith and hope of God's elect. So that's a handy little one to throw in, because that shows that at least in some proto, way, they're still trying to work out the language for it, there's already evidence of a Trinitarian nature from a document in 96 AD. Okay? Clement also gives us clear evidence that Paul went to Spain in chapter 5, which if any of you have ever wondered about that, that's a handy little thing to know. Right? Clement also attempts a variation on Paul's love poem in his own letter to the Corinthians. So you remember, ever been to a Christian wedding? 1 Corinthians 13. Well, this is Clement just tweaking that, and this is what he says. If there is true Christian love in a man, let him carry out the precepts of Christ. Who can describe the constraining power of a love for God, its majesty and its beauty? Who can adequately express? No tongue can tell the heights to which love can uplift us. Love binds us fast to God. Love casts a veil over sin innumerable. There are no limits to love's endurance, no end to its patience. Love is without civility, as it is without arrogance. Love knows no divisions and promotes no discord. All the work of love are done in perfect fellowship. It was in love that all God's chosen saints were made perfect, for without love, nothing is pleasing to him. It was in love that the Lord drew us to himself, because of the love he bore us. Our Lord Jesus Christ, at the will of God, gave his blood for us, his flesh for our flesh, and his life for our life. So you can see there quite adamantly, there are deep Christian resonances there, and actually in a lot of ways elaborations on that are really good, right? The key point to come back to with Clement is that while he's just a little less revolutionary. I guess that's where I'm kind of going here. There's less of a revolutionary tone to him. It's more you kind of, the early stages of a certain institutionalism. Key thing with him is this idea of who is your leader, and has that leader, where did he get his qualification from? And did he get it from someone who got their qualification, from someone who got their qualification, from someone who got their qualification, from an apostle, and from Jesus? Right? Some of you here will have been here when we've had Father Silouan from the Greeks. I actually have a lot of time for Silouan. He's a great bloke, and I love him dearly. And one of the things that you'll remember that he said was, "Who is your father? Who are you answerable to?" That is a Greek Orthodox idea that is a continuation of this very point. It's the continuation of the point that if you don't just pick up any guy that you see walking off the street with a cool, Christian meme. You pick someone who you can trust because they, through the Spirit of God, have been discerned to have the qualities of a leader, by someone who is qualified to do that because they have the Spirit of God, which can be discerned as a passing down from generation to generation through the work of the true church to Christ. So if you want to wonder why he's asking that and why the Orthodox look at us Protestants with such disdain, this is why. Okay, now, on the other hand, we have another letter written not long afterwards from Rome that is just completely different, but awesome, and that is the Shepherd of Hermas. Probably written about around 120 AD, the Roman Christian Hermas received several visions that he hoped Clement would send out to the church at large from Rome. It was broken up into three parts: the visions, the commands, sometimes called the mandates, and some parables called the similitudes. Right? In one of the visions, so part of the reason why I make that thing is because there's a little light suggestion in it that it's written from like 96 AD, but it's blatantly obvious that it's from 120 AD. And so this is part of the reason why it was always a little confusing as to whether it could get into the canon, because if it's 120, just nah, like that's far too late. If it's 90s and it's like during Clement's time in Rome, you might be able to sneak it in. In the end, the dating of 120 won out, and that's why it's not in the canon. There are other reasons why, but yeah. In one of the visions, Hermas tells, and this is a really interesting point, he says, I saw across from me, because like these are all visions. Hermas says, I saw across from me a large white chair made of wool, white as snow. And an elderly woman came, dressed in radiant clothes and holding a book in her hands. Right? And then you keep on reading, and what you're waiting to find out is, who's the old lady? Who's the old lady? Who's the old lady? And you find out that the old lady is the church. Now, why is that interesting? The reason that's interesting is because he meets an angel who explains that the church is old. It's old, man. And that's interesting, of course, because we're going, 120? Honey, you got a long time coming. You got a fair old while to go, sister, if you think you're old now. Right? And so part of the dynamic that he's dealing with here is, and this is common certainly in later church fathers as well, Chrysostom talks in this term, that age is fundamentally linked for them, and I think for a lot of people, with health. And health is linked with sin. And sin is linked with your relationship with God. So let me unpack that for you. If you have a good relationship with God, sin isn't as much of a problem for you, which means that you live a vibrant, healthy life. And then you can run around all over the place and you feel energetic. And I mean, like, you know what I mean? Like, the people who are in your congregations who are like, 70 or 80, but they still climb upstairs like there's no tomorrow and have a certain energy about them, or even if they can't do that, just when you're talking to them, the lights in their eyes and that kind of stuff. So age is not contingent to that. It's contingent to, I've met old people that look healthier and happier than people in their 30s or 20s. Like, you know what I mean? And part of that, and there can be any number of reasons why someone's unhealthy, but part of that can sometimes be about like that they've lived a wild, unhealthy life, right? It's not as simple as that, but you can kind of see where I'm going here, what I call the Lindsay Lohan effect. So when they're talking about age here, they're saying the church looks tired. It's only 120 AD. Harden up, church. But part of the thing that they're trying to get across here is that the church looked old because it looked tired, because it had lost its way and become sinful, because it wasn't having a good relationship with God anymore. So the Shepherd of Hermas is a powerful challenge to the church of the time to say, get back onto it, like be revived through the life-giving, almost youthful rejuvenation that the Spirit gives you. Be revived. Okay. He meets an angel who explains why the church should appear so old. Hermas is told that the reason that the church is the first created thing, but that's not the reason she looks old. There's a different reason. In the first vision, why did she appear to you as an elderly woman seated on a chair? Now the you there in Greek is actually singular. So he's saying to Hermas, why to you did she look like an elderly woman sitting on a chair? Then he flips, because your spirit, and by now, and that's actually a plural, so now he's not talking just to Hermas, he's talking to Hermas and all the church he's a part of. Your spirit is elderly and fading away, having no vigour, because you are feeble and of two minds. For just as elderly people who have no hope of being rejuvenated look forward to nothing but their sleep, that is death, so also you, and again it's that plural, grown feeble because of your worldly affairs, have handed yourselves over to apathy, and you do not cast your anxieties upon the Lord. Your mind has been wounded, and you have grown old in your sorrows. Isn't that a fascinating concept? Yeah, it's got a bit of revelation about it. So part of the thing that I think you can start to see from this is that while Clement had kind of come in with a bit of settle down everyone, and that was probably appropriate for his period, it had been continued for the next 20 years to a point where it had all got a bit stale and people didn't have that vibrancy of the Spirit anymore. And so Shepherd of Hermas comes in to slap them around a bit and tell them, wake up to yourselves. Remember, this is probably a document written in about 120 AD. What this indicates is that very early on there has been a propensity within the church for it to see itself as becoming stale and needing revival. We identify revival with, say, the Reformation or Wesley or Spurgeon. Dude, you can get to revival a heck of a lot earlier than you might expect. Right? Hermas's work was incredibly popular and was in the running to be included in the New Testament stages. There are other rather significant elements that come out of the book. It's actually quite a long book, including a great respect for virginity and a dislike for continual sin, especially after baptism. So famously, Hermas encourages an idea of what you might call 2 strikes you're out. So once you're baptised, if you do a really, really bad sin after that, you get one chance, baby. You do a second one, you're out of the church. Okay? But more than that, the other thing is the virginity aspect. And this is where the early church mother's side comes out. The veneration of single women as being able to be prominent contributors to the ministry of the church is not a later thing. Like, basically, nuns are not a thing from, like, the 4th century onwards. They're as early as early 2nd century. And why that's important is because you have to understand what dynamics the respect and financial support of women not having to be married means within a Greco-Roman culture. It means that women, often for the first time in their lives, are in the position where they can say, I don't need to marry him. I am not going to marry him. I am going to give my life to God, and the church will support me in my independence from being under a man's control. And God thinks it's right that I don't follow that system. Right? Okay? Now, am I suggesting that that just means that the church was always just hunky-dory with its understanding of women? No. But I am saying that we can already see from that perspective that there are hints of giving women voice and respect and financial independence that we might not have expected. Yeah? Well, see, even then that's different. Those are primarily focused around domestic relationships. That's not actually about virginity at all. And even if you did want to go into the pastoral epistles, there's quite clearly indications within the pastoral epistles that women are being encouraged not to need to get married if they don't want to, right? 1 Corinthians certainly makes that point, but also there's points about deaconesses and stuff like that within the pastoral epistles. So anyway, I'm going to keep on going. Ignatius of Antioch. Ignatius is kind of cool, just thrown out there. Ignatius was sent from Antioch in Syria to Rome under heavy guard to be executed, possibly as a publicity stunt. So this happens around about 107 AD. Okay, all right, just about. It happens pretty much on 107. What happens is that there's an emperor at the time who gets a letter from his local governor in Bithynia, or Asia Minor. And the guy goes, there's all these Christians running around and they're driving me crazy and I don't know how to deal with them. Every time I kill them, it just makes more of them pop up. It's really irritating. And every time that I try to question them, they just throw all this religious stuff at me and I don't understand it. It's just stupid. What do I do? Should I just kill them all? And in response, Trajan, who was the emperor, wrote to him and said, no, you don't hunt them down, because if you hunt them down and all that, you make them into more than they are, right? It's like almost parenting, don't make big of a scene about it, because once you do that, you're just going to get more of it, that kind of a thing. So he says, if you find any Christians, okay, give them a warning, let them go. Don't make a big thing of it. If they really drive you nuts, then you send them to me, okay? And I'll deal with them, right, over in Rome. So the idea was to isolate them from where their support base was, wherever they were, right? So Ignatius is in Antioch, and they go, you are a real troublemaker, son. You're a bishop who's driving everyone crazy here. We got to get you out of here. Just, get you out from that. And he goes, oh, fine. That's good. Happy to go. Sure, whatever you say. While I'm going, do you mind if we just stop off here, here and here? Yeah, well, they're on the main trade route and main route there. Sure. Mind if I just catch up with some mates while I'm there? And what he does is he subsequently writes a series of letters to all of those churches that just makes them go all bunter for Jesus, right? So it's really quite fun, right? When they got to Laodicea, they had to make a choice between two roads. One went through Tralles, Magnesia and Ephesus, while the other went through Philadelphia and Sardis. When they couldn't get to Philly or Sardis, they sent delegates to meet him. They met up with him once he got to Smyrna, where there was a delay while they waited for a ship. And so he also sent letters to the Trallians, Magnesians, and the Ephesians to say, hey, thanks for thinking of me. And by the way, stay with Jesus. It's great. He also wrote his letter to the Romans in preparation for his arrival, which in itself, like all of this stuff is great fun to read. If you get to read anything out of tonight, just Google it, find it any way you can. The Penguin Early Christian Classics, great volume for this, but any way you can, read his letter to the Romans. It is just gold, right? And I'll get to that if I can. He also read his letter to the Romans in a preparation for his arrival. Once on the boat, they stopped at Troas, where Ignatius wrote letters to the Philadelphians and the Smyrnans, as well as a personal letter to Polycarp, Smyrna's bishop. There are several key themes that permeate all of these letters, with the exception of the Roman one, which is just a beast of its own. Right? One of them was the apparent threat of Docetism in the churches. Now, you might be sitting there going, ah, yes, Docetism, I know it well. Right? Let me explain what Docetism is. Docetism is the idea that it's built on kind of Platonism. It's the idea that material is bad and spirit is good, and that therefore Jesus couldn't possibly have had a physical body, because if he did have a physical body, oh my goodness, that would mean that he was evil, because matter is evil. So there were lots of people running around saying that Jesus had only faked having a physical material body. Right? He'd always just been pure spirit, but he just looked like he had a material body. From 107 AD, the church that isn't under the apostles is still maintaining, held to the no, Jesus really did have a physical body. They are not being attracted or driven away from that into kind of a Greco-Roman Platonic idea that the material is evil. They are insisting, in spite of Greco-Roman cultural attacks against that idea, right? They are adamantly maintaining that Jesus really was God, but with a physical body. Okay? And why? Because the apostles had taught them that, and because it had really, really important implications. Okay? Now, just give me 2 seconds. Okay, so I just realised I might just chuck in a little extra bonus for you, because I can. Okay. Yeah, you totally have to pay. Okay, I got it now. So, this is what he says about Docetism. Close your ears then, if anyone preaches to you without speaking of Jesus Christ. Christ was of David's line. Okay, so he's already establishing a historical connection through kind of blood, if you like. He was the son of Mary. He was verily and indeed born and ate and drank. He was verily persecuted in the days of Pontius Pilate, and verily and indeed crucified, and gave up the ghost in the sight of all heaven and earth and the powers of the netherworld. He was also verily raised up again from the dead, for his Father raised him. And in Jesus Christ will his Father similarly raise us who believe in him. Since apart from him, there is no true life for us. It is asserted by some who deny God, in other words, who have no faith, that his sufferings were not genuine, though in fact it is themselves in whom there is nothing genuine. Flee for your very life from these men. They are poisonous growths with a deadly fruit, and one taste of it is speedily fatal. Okay? So what you can see from this is a guy who sees all of the hope that we have in Jesus Christ tied up with him not just being some ethereal figure that you would actually, believe in your heart, but that, notwithstanding the importance of the Spirit's influence on our heart, that Christ was a historical figure who lived, was born, who lived in a historical period that can be historically and verified and identified. That's what the Pontius Pilate part is there. Who died and who was resurrected. And furthermore, he ties that intimately to our own salvation. That because, I wonder where he's getting this from. It's from the New Testament letters, isn't it? If we died with him, we will live with him. More than that, Ignatius quotes a Christian hymn, and this is always cool. Whenever you get a Christian hymn from this period, it's really handy, because what it gives you is a window into not only what that person thinks, notwithstanding the influence, that's really important, but it also shows you what other Christians were regularly engaging in worship. Right? So there is only one physician, he writes, very flesh, yet spirit too, uncreated and yet born, God and man in one agreed, very life in death indeed, fruit of God and Mary's seed, at once impassible and torn by pain and suffering here below, Jesus Christ, whom as our Lord we know. Right? Now it's kind of handy that they managed to make that work out in English in a rhyme as well. Right? But it's still really interesting, some of the ideas that are there. So the fact that Christ was fully flesh and fully spirit. The idea that he was uncreated and yet born. That's a really interesting one, because what that implies, and we as Christians just take this for granted, but it's actually quite a big statement to say, like you and me, we're born. We weren't around before then. By saying he is uncreated, what that's implying is he's eternal. He's pre-existent. Right? That's actually kind of a big deal. Right? God and man in one agreed. Like, there's just no getting around that one. Like, that's 107 AD, and the church is explicitly talking in terms of Jesus being God. Right? Even giving him really interesting attributes of God. So he is both impassible and torn. Impassibility is about God not being able to change or suffer, and yet he's torn at the same time. So what Ignatius is recognising is that the church at this point is dealing with the funny paradoxes of the Christian religion. That a God who is beyond suffering can suffer. Things like that. Okay. Bedenson says that in Ignatius, Christianity is Christ in us. Therefore, again, an emphasis on unity being essential. The key mechanism for this to take place is, funnily enough, the clergy, the episcopate, right, the bishops. This is because the clergy are essential for the administering of the sacraments and the worship of the church. And the sacraments are really important, because what's the whole point of the Eucharist? What is the whole point of us having the Eucharist? This is my body. It's not my spirit. It's not me floating around. It's me being a real human body. And what does Jesus give us as our way of remembering that? Just an ethereal idea that we think through? No, he gives us bread and wine, things that are tangible, real. At my church recently, I think I've been trying too hard. I'd read Ignatius too recently. I did this talk where we had the elements here. A bit of a digression, but I don't care. We were doing the Eucharist, and we had the elements here, the bread and the wine, right? But what I did is I did the whole sermon, the whole Eucharist bit over here, and I said, here we have the bread and the wine, and it's really great, and it tastes really good, and that kind of stuff. Who wants to come up to help me take it, and hand it out? Can anyone see any problem with what I'm doing? The problem was I was working with kids, because there were kids there, and the kids went, I'm used to playing make-believe, this is fine. So they came up the front, and so they're full on ready to take the imaginary elements and take them everywhere. The grown-ups cottoned on to what was going on and thought it was hilarious, and no one was getting me out of it. It was awful. But eventually I said, right, to the kids, one of them clicked, and he said, well, none of this is actually real, you're making it up. The real stuff is over there. And so I had to come over here, thank God. Right, now, the point was for me to show them that just as you can't have these fake things that don't exist when you can have the reality of bread and in our case, grape juice. We're Baptists. Pray for us. What the Gospels are trying to say, and what people like Ignatius are trying to say, is that we use real elements, material elements, about a spiritual reality because Christ is a spiritual reality that became material. He is God made flesh. So for Ignatius adds another dimension to what Clement was trying to say. Clement was trying to say you need to have this sense of historicity. I mean, that's effectively what apostolic succession is there to do. It's to give a sense of historicity. This guy was taught by this guy, who was taught by this guy, who was taught by a real person called Peter, who was taught by a real person who was God in flesh, who proved that he was God through the historical event that those guys witnessed, Peter and that witnessed, that he really was a real dude, and he really died, and he really came back to life again. It's to give a sense of historical continuity and verifiability to it. Well, just as that, the Eucharist for Ignatius is about the same thing. It's to give a historicity and a materiality and a reality to it, that it's not all mumbo-jumbo, fluffy duck, Spiro-type ideas, but it's about real events that really happen, that really you can celebrate. And he says you don't muck around with that kind of stuff. That's why you get a real priest to do it. You don't just throw it out at your home. Like, they do have agape meals at this point still, which are like more kind of fellowship meals. You know, those have more of the element of a potluck after dinner, after church service. You know what I mean? They're important because they represent fellowship and community, which is really important. But they don't have the same dimensions as the Eucharist does, which is a celebration of the historical fact that Christ was a material being and yet God at the same time. Now, all of this comes to the point of what he says about when he gets to the Romans. All of the rest of his letters are very important and interesting, and they have nuance to them, but they're all a little bit the same. Okay, like they're all fairly similar. And then you just get his letter to the Romans. And what happens with the Romans letter is the Romans really meant well, but what they did is they wrote to him that they were going to spring him. Okay, that's basically what it is. They were either going to campaign, like lobby, for him to get, free, or what they were going to do was they were actually going to grab him and spring him. And what he does in his letter to the Romans, he breaks all of the consistent themes that he's had in everything else. And in that one, he makes it, this is basically what he says. He says, I want you to do me no kindly disservice. In other words, I know you mean well, but no, I don't need you to spring me. Okay? What he's arguing is that him dying is actually totally fine. They're going to get into a lot of trouble if they do that, and it's going to end up ultimately proving counterproductive. But for him, his death is itself a testimony to the reality of the gospel. The reality of the gospel is that Jesus died and Jesus rose again. And that is not an airy-fairy story for him. It's an historical reality on which he's based his life. And we've already seen those kind of same dynamics, haven't we, in some of the stuff that Hermas and Clement wrote, right? And so what this allows him to emphasize, okay, is that when I die, that's actually me experiencing what Christ experienced. So when the Bible talks in terms of, like Paul famously says, as I said before, if we die with him, we will live with him, and if we endure with him, we will reign with him. Paul doesn't say, oh, that's really cute. Paul explicitly says, this is a trustworthy saying. This is a saying on which you can base your entire trust on. Well, for Ignatius, they took those kind of statements really seriously. And so for him, the process of him dying becomes in and of itself a representation of that very point. If we die with him, we will live with him. Okay? More than that, interestingly, he adds other dimensions to this. That at one point he talks about how his flesh will be ground like wheat by the teeth of the lions, And he talks in terms of becoming a wafer, like bread. And so what he's trying to do is he's clearly got the Eucharist on his brain because he's written lots of other letters about that. So what he's doing is he's saying these things are all interconnected for him. Christ's death and resurrection as a material being, God made flesh, is intimately tied with the celebration of that using material, real things, namely the Eucharist, bread and wine, and that his death is Eucharistic in the same way. It's an expression of the materiality of his faith. That this isn't some kind of airy-fairy story about, Hercules from who knows when, that we're pretty sure didn't really happen, but it's a really cool story, dude. No, this is actually something that really happened, has a historicity and a materiality to it, that meets us in our real lives day by day. Right? So that kind of gives you a little bit of a window into the early church fathers. And I guess as a summary, what I want to reiterate is, first of all, the strong emphasis on leadership and the strong emphasis on that leadership being connected to the historicity of Christ. That's my first point. The second point is this tension that we can already see in the early church between what, in modern terms, we might call a more liturgically kind of Christendom-y kind of model, and a vibrant, subversive, kind of more Pentecostal-y kind of thing going on. And you can see that in all of these guys. You can see it in terms of, Clement versus Shepherd of Hermas. So Clement's kind of going, settle down. He's like, the dad when the kids are getting a bit too rowdy. Whereas Hermas has more of the, don't settle down, get up, get into it. And then you have Ignatius speaking to that as well, who adds an interesting kind of interplay between the two. So for him, the liturgical elements that we would normally ascribe to settle down, namely the Eucharist, for him are a deeply subversive act, a defiant act, an act of saying, you think you can kill us? You got no hope, baby, because we will come back to life again. Finally, the element that I want that is an interesting tension within the forebears is their sense of order, but also misbehaviour. Right? So they're very committed to the idea of let's get together, be unified, let's be under leaders. Even Hermas is big on that. Let's be under leaders and let's try to just get things working right. And on an internal level, they're very keen on that. But when you look at how they want to go into the actual Roman state, they're very naughty. They're very disruptive. They're very cheeky. No, not in a not in a way of becoming terrorists or anything, but just in terms of taking key ideals that Romans take for granted, like the good of the empire and things like that, and just messing with it a little. They just aim to misbehave, right? That's exactly why Trajan and Pliny, the governor who he's talking about, was so irritated by them, because they were just so nice and yet so naughty at the same time. They're just messing with all of the norms and standards of how Romans thought the world was meant to work, because they're just bringing Jesus into it, and Jesus doesn't play by the rules that they want him to play by. And yet, he plays by other rules that just make their rules look so much lousier, This is part of the fun, the subversive. And, it's fun for the early church, but it's also, it's weird when you're reading Ignatius in Romans, And he really does talk about his death with almost a cheeky whim to it. Why? Because he knows where he's going. Right? Which leads to the last point, and that is that there is this deep sense of if we die with him, we will live with him. That deep sense that the historicity of Jesus and the reality of Jesus is intimately tied in with their salvation to a point where it gives them dignity, gives them courage, and gives them hope. Thanks.
Do the fathers, or mothers or whatever, or daughters or sons, provide any extra information about Christ or the apostles? Do we get anything extra from them, or is they don't go beyond what the New Testament says?
Okay. Excuse me. It's an interesting question. Not in terms of the historical data about Christ. They're not adding anything extra. There are extra biblical sources that try darn hard to make Jesus into some superhero moulding things out of clay and like birds suddenly popping out of nowhere and all kinds of fun stuff. But most of those are from actually later Coptic sources, so they're not actually from the Apostolic period anyway. And they're not part of mainstream. They're often in Coptic contexts, which are kind of more North African and a little off the beaten track. So in terms of these guys, no. But on other levels, what you do have is a growing sophistication isn't the right word, but adding more sophisticated theology to the implications of Christ.
Yeah. So it's building on it.
It's building on it, and it's building out the implications of that, particularly as their context becomes a little more intense in certain ways. So like Ignatius, nothing that he writes is contrary to the apostles. And none of it adds any historical data about Christ other than what we see in the New Testament. But what he does do is he adds richness to things like the idea that because Christ came and was God who died, we now can actually travel through his story, that kind of stuff. You know, he adds more dimensions of that kind of thing.
Right. Okay.
Thank you for all of that. It was really interesting. I'd never even considered or heard about it or anything like that. So it was really eye-opening.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think would have happened if all the people that you mentioned, if they had have got into the Bible, if there was a different criteria, if you like, or there was a Bible version 2 or something?
Okay, now there's an interesting that actually has two dimensions to it. One is, look, I've been really nice about the books, and there are things about them that I love, and I think that they're really great. But there are aspects of all of those texts that are deeply problematic. So most commonly, like for example with Clement does this thing where he talks about the phoenix, as I mentioned that briefly. The thing is, he treats it like, he's making other, allusions to nature as proof of, certain patterns of how God or anything works. And then he goes, why, look, I know in Egypt they have this other remarkable phenomenon called the phoenix. And did you know the phoenix actually does da-da-da-da-da? So if we were going to hold on to kind of the sense of scriptural authority we currently have, we'd either have to say he was wrong or start believing in phoenixes, and that'd be a bit problematic, right? So on one level, we kind of dodged a bullet there, and that's probably true for a lot of these. But there's a second dimension to your question, which is the sense of kind of a second canon. One of the things that frustrates me is, as you said yourself, no one's heard of these. No one reads them. No one... And the reason why I find it somewhat frustrating is because they're actually tremendously valuable resources. They're resources from a devotional point of view, and all kinds of things. You cut Clement some slack with the whole, thing of the Phoenix, because there's other stuff in there that's good and that would actually be beneficial for the church to hear now. By going a little too hardcore on the Bible alone, as Protestants have done, one of the downsides or costs of that is that we don't actually take seriously this massive corpus of reasonably good stuff that would be actually helpful to us, right? And if as our Orthodox or Catholic brothers and sisters do, what we did is we actually took seriously that these are not of the same authority as Scripture, but certainly things of beneficial use for the faith, then we'd be reading these things devotionally and everything. I know with my students, one of the things that I've often found is that it's really hard to get them to read this stuff at the beginning because they're good Protestants and they were told, if it's not in my Bible, you shouldn't read it. No. As if it's going to be a threat. If it's not in the Bible, it must have been evil. But once I actually get them started on it, usually they just can't stop. They get really into it because it broadens and enriches their faith without the pressure of it. This is the Word of God, so it's got that a little bit more leeway, if you like. So, yeah, great question, thank you.
The church was built on it, though. I mean, these were...
Yeah.
When you're writing a book, man.
Well, I'm never going to write a book as well as Shepherd of Hermas, but you're right, the church is built on these things, right? Because, the thing is, the Bible is really important. I'm an evangelical, so I'm going to say that and I'm going to hold to that. The Bible is really important, but one of the risks that we play with when we don't recognise these other dimensions is we place we place upon the Bible expectations and responsibilities that it was never meant to fulfill. Right? Just because it's God's word doesn't mean that it's meant to do everything for us. It is meant to do very specific things. It's designed by God in His wonderful providence to do certain things for us. And the wider church corpus of the Apostolic Fathers and so on and so forth is part of God's, in His providence, helping to round out aspects of what we need to be good Christians that we wouldn't be able, we can't expect the Bible to provide for us. So what we do, by thrusting those aside, either we end up trying to do the same job that these guys did when they were really smart and they knew what they were doing. Or what we do is we go to the Bible and ask it questions that it never wants to answer because it's not meant to answer them. This stuff does. Do you see what I mean? Right? Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just curious, you mentioned this story about the Phoenix a couple of times. Excuse me. Did he, when he was mentioning it, when he was just talking about it in his writings, do you get the sense he's trying to inform his readers of something they don't know, or alluding to something he expects them to know in order to make a point? And because I'm thinking of, we've all grown up thinking that lemons throw themselves off cliffs into the sea to drown themselves because of a spurious documentary that I think was a Disney production back when I was a kid. And the other one that's spurious is this story that we allude to as a metaphor of ostriches. Everyone knows what ostriches do. They put their head in the sand, except they don't.
Don't, yeah.
So was it that sort of thing, or was he, trying to tell us something new, and was it an illusion or a figure of speech like that?
Okay.
I don't think you've actually explained what the story of the Phoenix bird is.
It's like the Phoenix, in case you're wondering, the mini version of the Phoenix, it's in Harry Potter, so obviously. Is the idea that there's this bird that when it is killed, specifically burned, it comes back to life again. It's a symbol of resurrection within, if we take it very seriously, it's actually part of Egyptian folklore and religion. In terms of
that's every 500 years or something,
pardon?
Isn't there a 500 years?
Yeah. I always find it a bit fuzzy. In terms of what you're saying, there is a time, you've got to remember two things. One, there's not much tourism at this point, so it's not like people who are living in Corinth are probably going to go over to Egypt too much, where they would see it. Neither's Clement, so that's the first dimension. And what that meant was there was a common tendency within literature at the time for people to talk about things that they'd heard happened, but they never actually witnessed it themselves. But it just kind of become folklore kind of thing. So there's that dimension, and as well as that, he's talking to people who, the Corinthian church is actually part of the divisions, is actually that it's from many different classes. And so some of those classes would be familiar with the Phoenix story and others wouldn't. So he kind of talks in terms of that, some of you might know, but in case you don't, that kind of feel. Yep.
Is that very similar to like Lilith in the Bible, which is like folklore, which is actually in the Bible? So we're kind of getting, it's actually in the Bible.
Well, it's deuterocanonical, which is kind of fun as well.
Is it like reality, or is it make-believe?
Okay, so Lilith's an interesting one, because then we're talking about the deuterocanonical books, which is another fun conversation for you to get someone to do a talk on at some point at this. So if you wanted to take a different line, so Lilith might be a problematic example because it's in a section called the deuterocanonical, so we'll just put that aside. But if you wanted to take another one where people often debate whether it really happened or not, say Job, right? And so Job can be both, some people will argue that it doesn't need to have actually historically happened. It's meant to be a narrative or something like that. Other people will find that deeply problematic. The point is, kind of coming back to yours, is you could try to play that with something like Clement as well, but the point is you don't need to, because it's not an authoritative document that we've placed with biblical authority that needs to be infallible. So we don't even need to worry about it. We're all cool. Right? So, okay, what else we got? Yep.
I understand that about 90% of the early church were Aramaic speakers, that 9/10 of the people, most of the apostles went east, and that the early church was mostly in the east, and that probably the original language is Hebrew, translated to Aramaic, or certainly Aramaic, eventually translated.
Yeah, I'd probably go more that way. Yep.
Into Greek and then into English. But you never hear about any sort of church fathers from the Aramaic side of things. I mean, there are very good Aramaic English translations which have got little sort of errors that have crept into the Greek exposed. There's nothing that important, but it seems that there's a lot of Western sort of church fathers we hear about, but nothing about the Aramaic or the Eastern ones.
Right, now that's a really interesting point. So, partially that's because of the culture that had been... I agree with you to an extent. So you're right, in terms of the weight, so say we put kind of Jerusalem here, right, kind of like Israel here, you can go east and you're off into kind of like Persia and that kind of stuff, and even if you just hang around here and say go Syria and stuff like that, that's going to be a deeply Aramaic culture, okay? Over on the west, you're going to get into the Greco-Roman culture, which we have with like the Roman Empire. You're right in that the vast majority of the literature that we have, including the New Testament itself, is deeply formed by the Greco-Roman culture. Part of that is precisely because, as many historians have often pointed out, the very nature of the Greco-Roman culture afforded the propagation of literature, the propagation of religion in ways that most other cultures never got the chance to actually do. And that's another fascinating lecture in and of itself in terms of the role of roads, political stability, common language, that kind of stuff. So you're right, I categorically agree with you that there's much more literature over here. Having said that, there are interesting documents around Aramaic, if not Aramaic, certainly Syriac, which is very linguistically similar, from around about this period. There are a lot of Syrian Christians who were writing. Most interestingly, for me, one of the most interesting things about that is the hymnology of Syriac Christians at this point. And this is where you start, Christianity in this period is really fascinating in that you have dimensions of cultural norms and contextual norms, even between different groups of the Roman Empire. Like Bithynia is very different from Rome, that kind of thing. So you have those dynamics. But as well as that, you start to see that there are, like, you know, groups like the Syrians who are still writing and speaking in a different language and so on and so forth. And yet, the overarching consistency of their theology. You know, this is what I find really fascinating, is that these are people from very different contexts. We're still in a point where no one can just nail it down and say, it's in my Bible and we're done. So that opportunity for consistency isn't there. But at the same time, they already they're still talking about the same thing. And a lot of their motifs are the same motifs. And a lot of their doctrines, all the important ones, are actually the same.
Are there Syrian writers?
Yeah, and I cannot remember for the life of me their names. I might have them in my notes. I can tell you about them afterwards if you like. I mean, it's not a massive corpus, particularly in comparison, as we said, to that whole Roman side. But certainly, yeah. Interestingly, like the extent of that, I think it's a really good point because it shows that while we obsess about the Roman stuff, that's really to do with our sources. When actually there's plenty of evidence of Christianity having significant impact in other places, we just don't have as many sources about it. One of the things to realise is that, for example, Armenia became the first Christian country. It jumped ahead of Constantine, right? So Armenia, which is not part of the Roman Empire at all, and is much closer to the kind of Aramaic, Syriac kind of culture that you're talking about, it becomes a Christian nation before Constantine, right? Ethiopia becomes a Christian nation, independent of anything to do with Constantine, right? And around about the same time as Constantine. So while we do focus very much on this Greco-Roman area, that's not actually all of Christianity's story. It's a really good point.
Any documents south to India where...
Yeah, the Thomas stuff? No, it's a lot harder to play with that kind of stuff. So yeah. Yep.
Jewish were very strict on their books as well.
Yep.
And yet they have allowed knowledge. They've kept it. I mean, this is that part, but they've built on. You've got this.
The Talmud and
yes,
yeah,
and
that kind of
they've got
stuff.
layers and layers. And when they're studying it, they don't just stick with their original.
Yeah.
They use.
Well,
it's sad that much of our church seems, learning here, seems to have lost.
Yeah, but that's only a Protestant thing.
Yeah.
Like, to be honest, like if Silouan was here, Silouan tonight would have been bored out of his brains because he's been reading this stuff devotionally for years.
Yeah.
Okay? Because for him, it's just what they do. Catholics have always done this. Part of the Benedictine monastic tradition was that you were expected to read at least an hour or something like that every day. And that was from books like this, or Cassian's Conferences, which is another historical document from a little after this, and things like that. It was just what you did, right? It's only because of our over-emphasis on sola scriptura to the detriment of all of this other stuff that we as Protestants are having conversations like tonight and you're all going, wow.
How did you get perverted into it?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. How did I get tricked, you might say? How did I get tricked into doing this? It's an interesting question. So I probably got into this more at Regent than I did at... I did a Masters of Divinity here in Adelaide, and that was cool and that was great. Then I went to Regent College, which is in Canada, and there they got me reading these kind of things as part of my Masters of Theology. And I kind of went, it's probably dodge, because I had a lot of those Protestant biases. What I found was when I read them, they just didn't stack up to all of my biases. I expected them to be dodge, and they weren't. They were awesome. Right? So one of my little sidelines that I often tell students about this kind of stuff is ignorance breeds prejudice and prejudice breeds ignorance. And what I mean by that is I had been taught, right, you don't need to know those texts because they're bad. So my ignorance bred my prejudice. But my prejudice said to me, don't read those things because they will make you bad. They're infectious almost. So then I never read them, which fed the prejudice, which fed the ignorance, which fed the prejudice, and around it went. And the only cure to that, ever, is to break the ignorance. The prejudice won't break without the ignorance breaking. So that means you just got to sit down and you've got to face up to it. Now, clearly that indicates that I have completely lost my faith and I've lost my mind and I'm a heretic now. Or what it's meant is that actually they weren't as bad as everyone said, and if I read them, I realised it wasn't as bad as said. They told me. So. Okay, yeah, now you were going to ask a question.
Yeah, well, thank you for your lecture. It appears to me that church hierarchy with a pyramidal authoritarian structure is more a hindrance than a help to find faith.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point, Peter. So, so just if you missed it, the idea is that this hierarchical structure is actually counterproductive. Okay, I want to just preface my statement at this point that I am a Baptist, right? And so we don't do this kind of hierarchical, what is called an Episcopalian model very well. We're not remotely interested in doing it, and I just think that we're right. Okay, so just put that there. But at the same time, I listen to my brothers and sisters in the Episcopalian churches, Episkopos, Greek for effectively bishop, right? So the more hierarchical models. And I think you're right, Peter, in that it runs tremendous risks. But actually all of them run risks. And the thing is that both of them have their downsides. So if I was being more like Silouan or someone like that, one of the arguments that they would make is, at least within that structure, you are being held accountable to someone who has some degree of qualifications other than, I really like what he says up the front. Whereas in a lot of Protestant circles, it can have a degree to tend towards celebrity or to the latest snazzy suit or that kind of stuff, instead of actually what's their actual qualifications, you know, that kind of thing. That's the risk with it. But coming back to your point, that authoritarian thing, one of the things that many classical historians and early church historians will say is they will say that the weight placed upon apostolic succession, this idea of this trained by this, trained by this, trained by Peter, trained, it was asked to carry a weight that it ceased to be able to bear. Right? That it was a good idea when it was like the first couple of periods after the apostolic era. Like, it was okay up until, say, 200 AD. But at that point, it all starts to break down because the connection has too many kind of loose ends to it. Anyone who's been in leadership knows you can say, I reckon this guy's a great leader, and he is for the first 10 years, and then he goes completely off the rails. Well, if he's now part of the apostolic succession, it means the next guy that he gets is probably not going to be any good, And so placing that kind of succession, every time that you're going to the next link in the chain, there's a potential for that chain to be weak and to break and to go all kind of pear-shaped, right? So the sense of a link of chain is really, I think, is a really helpful analogy for understanding the whole dimension of the apostolic succession, because it only takes one of those to break for the whole thing to just become pear-shaped.
Doesn't it go against kind of the Australian ethos of egalitarianism?
Egalitarianism, and that's a fair call as well. Part of it is our own cultural biases against hierarchical systems. And we have excellent reasons for doing that. We also have reasons that actually make it counterproductive to us. There are times where it's actually a good thing to be under hierarchical systems. I say that not liking hierarchical systems. I'm a Baptist. Of course I don't like them. But I am aware enough to recognise that there are downsides to my position as well. So, yeah.
My question was based on my experience.
Yeah. And to be honest, man, your experience is very consistent with lots of people's experience. Equally, other people will have the experience of having someone who has no connection but had a really cool, experience or some other qualification ascribed to him other than a sense of succession or appointment, if you like. And that can actually go pear-shaped too. And I think this actually does come back to a subliminal hint at how good leadership is framed that Clement actually gives us. and that is it's spirit infused. And while they saw that as proof of succession, I think we can say, irrespective of that, irrespective of whether that succession is neat and tidy, a sense that God's Spirit is working in a person, not in terms of spectacular acts of miracles or stuff like that, but in, I might suggest, the work of godliness and humility that the Spirit works in a leader, and the changing in character. Those are actually the traits that we need in good Christian leaders, right? And that can happen within that succession kind of thing. You hope it does, but it can happen in other areas as well. So, yeah, cool. Yeah.
So we talk about ignorance. My ignorance is probably the deepest in the room, so deep I couldn't form prejudices, right? And in case there's one or two others like that, can you recommend
some books,
accessible texts on this topic, and some readable versions of the letters and so on that you talked about?
Yep, awesome. So we were talking about that during the break, and thank you for bringing it up. I appreciate it. So in terms of a book to get you into the early church. So as a historian, we talk in terms of two kinds of documents. We talk in terms of secondary documents and primary documents, just in case you're not familiar with these terms. So primary documents are documents written by the people at the time. So when I was quoting Clement, I was quoting a primary document. A secondary document is one written by someone about that stuff, just to kind of give you the feel and the context. So in a way, tonight's talk was me being a secondary document for you. Eglin Hinson's The Early Church is a really good entry point early church-focused history. Okay? And so if you're looking for a good secondary document, that's a good thing. If you're actually thinking, wow, that's really awesome, but I'd like to know about the whole thing, right, then I would probably recommend as a great entry point, church history in plain language.
Are they both in print at present?
Oh, yeah. Yep, you shouldn't have any problem. And you can also get them on Kindle, I believe. Right? So church history in plain language is...
Bruce Shelley.
Yeah, Bruce Shelley. No, thank you, Shelley. Both of those are just rip snorting reads. Okay? So there, in terms of secondary documents. Hinson, obviously more specific on the early church period. He goes to around about 500-600 AD. And then Shelley is more your whole broad sweep. Okay, the whole kit and boodle, the last 2,000 years. Right? Now, in terms of the primary documents that I've been talking about today, the Penguin Classics right, has an early Christian writings. Okay? And another option is that you just name one of these people that we've been talking about today, and you just look it up on the internet and you'll find them. Okay? So on one level you could just do that. There was a guy called Schaff who actually wrote a whole series of like amazing compendiums called the Ante-Nicene Fathers and the Post-Nicene Fathers of all of this stuff.
You can get that on there.
And you can get those for free off the internet, no problem. If you want to do that kind of a stuff, you can go to a website which is called ccel.org. And that's great, because you will never tire of finding awesome stuff on there. And that's not just an early church thing, that's just anything. You can find like Ignatius, and you can find Spurgeon. It's just amazing.
Is that the Ethereal Library?
Yes, the Christian Classics Ethereal Library. It's run out of Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Now, I will say that with internet sources, they're all free. And the reason they're free is because they're out of copyright. And the reason they're out of copyright is because they're over 100 years old, like the actual translations are 100 years old. And what that means is they often lend themselves to rather hard English. So if you want to go free, you do that, but you got to realise that you're going to be going through, first of all, the punching through the barriers of the cultural differences between first century Greco-Roman culture and today, but you'll also be going through the linguistic barriers between you and kind of 19th century English. So if you want to spare yourself that pain while enjoying the early Christian writings, go for the Penguin Classics. And they write, what they do, it's a bit like if you have to choose between reading like a 19th century biblical translation as opposed to the NIV. You'll probably find the NIV is pretty easy to read. You can read the other one, but it's a heck of a lot more hard work. You know what I mean? Similar kind of dynamic with this. Yeah? Cool. Yeah?
Hey, Matt, I wonder if you'd say something about martyrdom. We know that Stephen's known as the first Christian martyr.
Yep.
And there are other martyrs mentioned in New Testament times. You know, some of the leaders of the Jerusalem church, for example, they were martyred by the Roman rulers. So the martyrdom goes right back to the very beginning, of course, in following Christ. But there became a willingness to be martyred, even for some in the early Christian church, almost a desire.
Oh, death wish.
To be martyred.
Yeah, full on.
Now, does Ignatius fit into that? Or is it
it's an interesting thing.
Is it before or after that period?
He's before Ignatius. When I met him in glory, he can probably say, I was doing martyrdom before it was cool. Okay? In that, yeah, there are martyrs who are doing a lot of this kind of stuff at this point, but it hasn't reached the point where it's just considered such a great thing to do that people are literally going out of their way to turn themselves in so they can be killed. Okay? So, famous story of Origen from Alexandria, where he was a pretty hardcore kind of guy in Oregon. And his dad had been martyred, and he was so inspired by that he went to his mum and told his mum, Mum, I'm going to the authorities today, and I'm going to get martyred today, yeah! And his mum realised he had no chance of actually talking him out of it. So she said, well, if you're going to be martyred today, good on you, but you can't go dressing and smelling like that. If you're going to get martyred, you should clean yourself up, make yourself look really nice for them. And he went, why, yeah, Mum, I should. And so what he did is he went and had a bath. And while he was in the bath, she stole all of his clothes. And said, I won't give you back your clothes until you promise me, under God, that you won't martyr yourself today. Mum. Right, and yeah.
How old was he?
He was 16. By 17, he became one of the greatest Christian theologians working at the Alexandrian University /library. It worked out. And then it didn't because it's Oregon. A fun story. Anyway, that's an indication of kind of where things have went. But to be honest, Oregon's kind of late by this point. Or at that age, he's kind of the 200s. Okay? So that dimension doesn't really kick in until then. What's around during this period is more the willingness for people to just not care if you kill them. Because I know where I'm going. Right? So,
we have other indications of that in the New Testament too, don't we?
Oh, yeah.
Paul saying, obviously in some of the writings like 2 Timothy, Paul is anticipating his martyrdom very soon after having written 2 Timothy, probably.
Yeah. So
before that, he says he's willing to.
Yeah.
To lose.
Yeah. Nothing to lose. I gain either way. Paul says in Philippians. Exactly. When Ignatius is going, he's going from Antioch, which is say here, using the you know where I am on the map that I never actually wrote up. Jerusalem here, Antioch's kind of here, and then he's going all across what we would now call Turkey. Across like this, and he's going towards Rome, which is kind of over here, which means he's always travelling which direction? West. And what he says here, at one point what he says is, I am going towards the west, like the sun. The sun goes to the west, and the sun sets. But we don't get worried when the sun sets, because we always know the sun will rise again. And so with me. Because so with Jesus. Right? So, like, that kind of assurance, it just permeates so much of the period. Polycarp, who, by the way, Ignatius writes to on the way, like I said, the best thing Polycarp did, and he had a really impressive career, was die. Right? When he dies, he just has such a degree of, I just don't give a stuff. Right? He openly pokes fun at the people who are killing him because he just doesn't care, because he knows where he's going. So at one point they say to him, you know, don't you realise I have the power to get rid of it, like give you your thing? Like, just renounce Christ. And he goes, man, I'm not actually paraphrasing that much. Man, I've been worshipping Jesus for 80 years. You think I'm going to give up now? Of course not. What do you want me to do? Do you want me to walk over there and set it to light myself? Let's get on with it. Right? There's that kind of an element to it. So, you know, yeah.
We know all this from Eusebius, don't we?
No, we don't even need to worry about Eusebius for Polycarp. Polycarp...
He obviously didn't tell us himself.
No, he didn't. But his actual followers, who were eyewitnesses to his death, they did. So what they did is they actually wrote his story and sent it around as a thing of edification and encouragement for the rest of the Christian community. And it became a really popular writing because everyone went, we love a good hero story. You know? Interesting. Because I haven't been controversial enough tonight. Interesting, one of the other things that they do is they actually take some of his bones out of the ashes.
Okay.
Right? Now, we as good Protestants, we get a bit squeamish about that. But part of the reason why they did that was, again, because of this sense of historicity. What they wanted to say was, he's not gone, he's merely asleep. But he was a real human being who really died, just like Jesus was a real human who really died. And we've got pieces of him right here that prove that he was a real person and he died. They're not worshipping it or anything. They're just recognising it as the historicity and the materiality of their faith is even found in people like Polycarp.
Is that the first instance of that in the Christian era? Because the Jews used to... It's not quite the same as the ossuary kind of dimension that you see in, say, in Jewish culture. But it's very similar in that, again, similar to Jewish ossuary stuff, it's tied up with the idea of resurrection of a bodily resurrection. And that there is a materiality to our faith that is entirely antithetical to the kind of Neoplatonic or Platonic anti-material religious philosophical system. So yeah.
I presume that a Christian should not be afraid to die, but you often see Christians getting jolly anxious about it.
Yeah.
And all the things they have to go through is, what's going on there?
I think that's an interesting question. I don't want to place that judgment on anyone. What I will say is that I think for some Christians, the fear that they have about death is not necessarily... Okay, I have a cat. And I remember when I got my cat as a kitten, this is years ago, one of the things that the cat seller told me was, if you know this, you know what I mean. She said, your cat is in this little box. When you get it home, the first place you need to put your cat is the smallest room in your house. And once she's got used to that room, you put her back in the box and you take her to the next biggest room. And you open the door, you open the box and you let her out. And you let her just feel her way around that. And then what you do is you take her to the next one. And eventually you get her to the biggest room. And I went, why? And the owner said, because if you put her in the biggest room ever, all she's ever understood was the little cage that she lived with her mum, which is small. And she's already got the distress of leaving her mum and all that, and her brothers and sisters and everything else. Now you're placing her into a new world, and that world is just so big it will overwhelm her and it will be very distressing for her. So start off small and then just go on from there, right? I think I've always found that a helpful understanding of how Christians who struggle with life after death and those dimensions, part of the reason for their fear is not, it's not like other people's fear necessarily. Maybe non-Christians have a similar dimension to it. But it's not that we are worried about what will happen to us or anything like that. It's the sense of awe and overwhelmingness that we realise that we are going to something so much bigger than we can comprehend. That's not fear as in, it's going to be terrible. It's just, whoa, it's a lot bigger than, whoa. That can be quite overwhelming. Right? Now, look, maybe at the same time, it's not my place.
Not liking the process as well.
Yeah, well, it's also, I mean, like she said, you're leaving everything that you've ever known before. Right? You know, we will not all die, but we will be changed. You know? And that dimension of the massive change, I mean, imagine you moving to a wonderful place like Hawaii. You're telling me, even as you're going to a wonderful place, it doesn't stop you from having butterflies in your stomach at the process of moving everything. We'll multiply that by 1,000,000 and you've got death. You know, so like, even though you might be well aware of, you know, Christ's assurance in the midst of it, that doesn't stop the awe and the overwhelmingness and the sense of missing and all those kind of dimensions that might be there for someone.